speaker to introduce the proposition, please, for 8 minutes.
Right now in France, there are lawmakers crafting legislation to deal with the Syrian refugee crisis without encompassing Syrians into their cabinets. Right now in the United States, there are lawmakers deciding what to do with undocumented workers and undocumented people without actually having those individuals crafting the legislation. Right now, in my hometown of Los Angeles, there's a 17-year-old girl just like myself who wishes to pursue politics one day. However, she knows that her status as an undocumented American will forever preclude her from better self-determining in the future because on Team Proposition, we fundamentally believe in a pluralism of voices and giving a voice to the voiceless. We are so proud to propose today's motion that this House would allow foreigners to run for public office. In this speech, a couple of things. First, some definition. Second, some points on framing. After that, I'm going to move on to introduce our first two substantive arguments that we principally allow for an increase of pluralism in democracy. Secondly, we think there are practical benefits that come when we actually have these foreigners allowing to run for public office. My third speaker will introduce our final substantive argument. By allowing these foreigners to run for public office, it's a check on hegemonic identities. First, some definitions. We define this House as the international community with democratic nations that allow for running and for elected positions. We define foreigners as individuals living in a country that they were not actually born in. So this could mean a Syrian refugee who has come to Europe. This could also mean an undocumented Mexican person in the United States who has come to the United States to make a better life for themselves. Secondly, thirdly, we define run as to campaign for public office, and we define public office as elected positions, everything ranging from city council to the Senate to the presidency. We define allow through our model, which will be that all foreigners in countries where they were not born ought to be allowed to run for the office in their respective governments freely and without restrictions, regardless of their documented or undocumented status. Now let's move on to a couple of points on framing. First, we tell you that through our model, we aim to increase the pluralism of voices as an intrinsic part of democracy because we believe this will result in an overall beneficiary and an overall beneficial good for the majority of people in these countries. Two facets of the way this debate is going to break down. We're going to address it on the principle and the practical level. This brings us into our burdens. We say the proposition burden is to show that by allowing for foreigners to run for public office, we both principally uphold democracy and we also practically make life better for these individuals, for the Syrian refugees, for these undocumented people. What today's debate is actually about. Conversely, the burden for Team Opposition is that they must disallow these individuals and these foreigners as the converse of allow for running for public office and show that by not having their voices in society and in these governments, it actually results in more tangible good. Now let's move on to the substantives of Team Proposition's arguments. First, that we principally allow for pluralism in democracy by having these individuals run for public office. Two facets of material under this point. First, how this principally upholds democracy by allowing them to run. Secondly, that when we don't allow them to do this, it actually undermines democracy. First level of analysis. Let's talk about what a democracy is. On Team Proposition, we believe that a democracy strives to incorporate the biggest breadth and the multifaceted symposium of voices and identities that we have in a society. It should be representative of this population, not just representative of the richest members in the populations or the whitest members in the population. It should be all of the people in the populations. We say that in order to do this, we cannot truly address the tangible material conditions of individuals living in a society if there are not people who are like them and have come from their backgrounds in those democracies. We say that we have a principle and moral obligation to incorporate these individuals into a society because it allows for a better pluralism of democracy and a greater respect for their rights. Yes?
Would you also allow foreigners to vote?
Yes, of course we would allow foreigners to vote. A key point of democracy is being able to vote. Right now in the United States, we see there's legislation about voter ID laws trying to systemically hold these individuals back. We reject that on the principle notion as well because we think that the hegemonic identities that control the power structure are intrinsically not upholding democracy. The second layer of analysis underneath this is that by not allowing these individuals to actually run for political office, we undermine democracy because we do not extend a recognition of our humanity to them as being capable of running in public office. Team opposition would disallow the presence of these individuals in public office and disallow the presence of their voices to create tangible change. On the most fundamental principle level, we believe we are morally obligated as the House, as the government in today's debate, to say that a Syrian refugee in France has the right to have his or her or their voice heard in their government. That is the fundamental principle we come to today. That is why we believe there is moral obligation to vote for team government in today's debate. Our second argument is the practical benefits coming out of this. We say that there are two levels of analysis. First, the benefits within the country. Secondly, the benefits outside of the country. Look to inside the countries the people have actually come to, inside the countries that the foreigners are currently living in. We say when they put their input into public office, when they can run, get elected, and even if they don't get elected, their mere presence doing so is beneficial because it results in tangible change both in legislation and in creating a cultural shift towards appreciation of their personhood. Legislation is just words unless it actually seeks to change the material conditions of the people they affect. This is why we say in the United States we have a horrible track record at actually encompassing the over 11 million undocumented people we have in our country. Recently, we saw that at a Democratic debate, we saw an undocumented woman actually voicing her opinions, asking a question to the candidates to ask how they would help her. We take that one step further. We say we want her in Democratic offices. We say we want her making these decisions in public office. We also see that when we have these practical benefits, people from Syria, for example, who are forced to leave their countries, these are educated individuals who have backgrounds in engineering, have gone to law school, and they're being systemically excluded from bringing their expertise to situations where they actually can create tangible change because they're seen as foreign. They're seen as the other. They're seen as not being able to actually run for these offices. Again, in the United States, we see that when people disliked Obama, they said he was from Kenya. Who cares if he's from Kenya? If he wants to do what's best for the country, we ought to extend the recognition to allow him to run. The second layer of analysis under this is how this actually, by allowing these individuals to participate and run for public office, it is better for international diplomacy. We say that these individuals, a Syrian refugee in France, is more uniquely predisposed to be able to understand how the French government should interact with other nations that the Syrian person has engaged with. We say this is fairly intuitive. We say that when we disallow this possibility, what ends up happening is we have a bunch of individuals sitting in their ivory tower trying to decide how to deal with the material conditions of other people in the rest of the world without first bringing those people into the cabinet in the first place. So what if we told you today on Team Government's side of the House? We say that when we fail to address the tangible needs of these people, of these foreigners, by disallowing them to run for public office, we shut out their potential to contribute to democracy, we shut out their voices. We say that they fail to understand their humanity and we otherize them when we do not give them the ability to run for public office. On Team Proposition, we believe that borders are just lines on maps that should not preclude you from actually creating more agency within the country you have chosen to go to. For all those reasons, I am so proud to propose, and I beg you all to do the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your speech. I now invite the first opposition member to deliver her speech.
Yeah, Michelle, could I have your phone to time? Ladies and gentlemen, we completely oppose a policy that will first of all harm foreigners themselves and will second of all diminish democracy and legitimacy in the government. Three arguments for this today. First of all, we're going to explain to you the role of the government. Then we're going to explain to you how this will actually backlash against minorities and the government. And third of all, we're going to explain to you how this can lead to corruption. But first of all, let's look at what side proposition has brought today. They told us that they would actually allow all undocumented people to actually run for office, and also they told us that all undocumented people could actually vote. We tell you that this completely undermines the category of a citizen. So anyone from another country, from another place, can actually go there and completely shift and completely change the course of elections. We tell you that this is not acceptable. So what happens if everyone from one country goes to another to influence the way it is actually being run? How can this actually be defendable? We actually do not believe it is. Now, let's also look at what they have told us. They told us that the burden was to prove that actually legislation would actually be improved, that actually conditions for immigrants would be improved if we allow them to go to public office. However, no thank you, however they failed to make a very important connection. They never told us how actually speaking, how actually being part of that country and actually being activists cannot actually all fulfill that role. How cannot actually that participation that is not in office, no thank you, can actually have that same effect, and because of this lack of connection, they never are able to justify completely why they should completely be allowed to go for public office. Therefore, we see their case does not uphold. Now, let's see also what they are allowing them with their model. They said they will allow understanding. We tell you that what we already said, that activism already also grants that. And moreover, they already stated that they would actually allow all undocumented people to actually go there. We tell you this can actually lead to mass influxes of immigrants who are not going to be able to sustain a government. And we also tell you that this can actually bring many, no thank you, this many negative effects on the government, which we'll explain with our constructive case. So now let's go to our constructive case. The principle and the role of the government. Through this argument, we're going to prove to you that the government's role is to protect their citizens, and how these policies will actually not allow us to do so. No, thank you. So, a government's first duty is to actually protect their citizens. That's why we have armed forces. Now, we actually see that the governments have pushed initiatives for their people to actually be protected first and foremost, because that's the people who own the country. The government is of the people who are citizens. Now, we see that, for example, there's quota systems when we're actually employing foreigners. No, thank you. For example, in the UK, the companies that actually want to hire a person have to interview nationals for 1 month before they actually can do that, and no one from that country, it has to be suitable for the job position before the person is hired. Governments protect their citizens. It is decided for governments that their citizens are the ones who actually host posts and jobs in office, both in office, no thank you, and in the business market. Now, we tell you that it's always favorable for a country that their citizens are the ones that are actually faring better. Why? Because if we actually see foreigners, they're also tied to another country. They're also tied to other set of beliefs. They're also tied to other interests that are not from the government. And we actually tell you that in the second layer of our analysis, I'll take in a second, that actually citizens tend to protect their citizens better. Would you disagree?
Okay, so why would a Syrian refugee who has been systematically oppressed by their own government show any more bonds of loyalty to their government that oppressed them than to their current country?
Actually, we're putting a very French case, and what we have to tell you that this is not always the case with all immigrants. And also, like when you're considering Syrian refugees, they might actually have an alignment, not within the government itself, but within other fractions. And we tell you that also this alignment is not from the country for the citizens of that place. Now, let's continue with why citizens protect their citizens. This is because they have a common background. They actually know the country. They actually have lived there, and they have a common identity. And when we actually see that citizens are representing citizens, we see this as a huge benefit because they understand them. There's empathy, thank you. And we actually see that it is much more beneficial for a public office. On our side, the probability of the interests of citizens being protected is much higher. On the comparative, they're allowing undocumented people to actually hold office without knowledge of the country, what it has been through, and also where it is going. No, thank you. So on their side of the house, we might actually elect someone who is not capable of understanding what are the problems where the government is facing. We don't think, no, thank you, that it is favorable for a society. However, now let's go to the second argument, that is a backlash for the government and for immigrants. Through this argument, we're going to prove to you that allowing foreigners to run for office will create a backlash against foreigners and destroy the national identity. No, thank you. And this comes in two layers. First of all, the national identity and trust in democracy. We tell you that if you actually see that the simple fact that you actually see that your government might not represent you, that perspective in itself alienates you from your government. What's the problem with alienation from the government? it actually means that you do not longer relate to it, you do no longer respect it, and what happens when you do not respect your government? Then what happens is the government becomes inefficient. Why? Because when you do not respect the government, you're much less likely to actually follow what they say.
Sir.
No, thank you. You're far less likely to actually obey the rule and to actually do what is said. That is why when you can actually see increases in crime rates from people who actually do not believe that the government is representing them. Or from undemocratic states where people do not relate to the government, crime rates are much higher. Now, let's see also how this government makes government inefficient. If you have populations who actually believe less in the government, who actually are less engaged in the government, then the government cannot actually pass policies
Sir.
to adapt, no thank you, to the changing needs of the population. You get a government that cannot actually adapt to the crisis, or the government cannot adapt to new policies or new measures needed to be taken, as the people who will not actually be involved with those because the perception is that the government will not represent them anymore. No, thank you. So, they are allowing citizens to vote. They're blurring these lines between foreigners and citizens. What they're creating is a violation of sovereignty, and what they're creating is that people can actually influence completely the way their government is being run. They can actually feel that the government is no longer theirs, and therefore this effect is actually much, much larger and actually can harm completely the people. No, thank you. So we tell you that this, in a second area of analysis, that this will also create more resentment towards minorities. Why? Because the very idea of foreigners running office will actually make the population perceive foreigners as power hungry and as people who are actually going there, who are going to that country only to influence elections. Much so if undocumented immigrants are actually able to vote, if they're actually able to move from place to place to actually adapt elections and change the course of them. Makes me tell you that this already happens with jobs. Like when there's a perception of society that immigrants are taking jobs away from them, there's a huge backlash against foreigners. They're actually oppressed and they're actually taken away. They're actually treated badly because they're perceived that they're taking something away from them. We tell you that government is much more intimate. Government is what represents them. Government is part of them. And when they actually feel that this part of them, this intrinsic part, what they belong to them, is completely alienated and taken away from them, they will see foreigners in a terrible light. And we tell you that we do not desire this for foreigners. Because once that you actually accept completely undocumented immigrants, what you're getting is that you're getting a government that does no longer represent anyone anymore, no one to actually support the government, and complete anger from the citizens towards minorities, complete neglection. And we actually believe that in our comparative, this is not desired. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. I now will invite the second speaker on the opposition to deliver her speech.
The first opposition speaker from their side of the House seems to suggest that our entire model would blur the line between what it means to be a foreigner and what it means to be a citizen. However, in doing so, they paint the stereotype of refugees as immigrants, as people who are more predisposed to crime, who are less intelligent, and will take away jobs from the current people of this world. However, that is the exact problematic mentality that we on Team Proposition wish to combat. We are the only side in this today's round that is recognizing the humanity of the migrants, of people who have come to different countries because of either systematic oppression in their home country, because of financial issues, or because of issues that we will never understand because we cannot purely speak for all of these people. Because we believe that we should give a voice to the voiceless instead of trying to speak for them, we are proud to propose today's motion. In this speech, I will be doing a few things. First, I will begin with some refutations onto the opposition's case by deconstructing their case essentially, then move back to rebuilding the proposition case, and finally introducing the third substantive argument, which is that the proposition model would allow for a check on hegemonic identity. But first, let's take a look at their case. Essentially, there are 2 points to be made. First, they say that the role of the government is simply to protect their own citizens, that governments don't have a responsibility to other people. However, 4 responses to this. First of all, in today's increasingly global diverse community, we cannot disentangle ourselves from global politics. It is completely impossible for any country to isolate itself and say we are only protecting the people who are citizens, not even the people who are technically undocumented but still living within our borders. Secondly, he talks about the importance of the role of government. But when we look to the United States' history, it was the government that put in Jim Crow laws that systematically disenfranchised the people. We need a check on the government, and that only happens when we have dissenting voices coming from the outside opinions. Third response to this, Team Opposition seems to suggest that foreigners would have stronger, more loyal bonds to their home country. But remember my POI. Why would a Syrian refugee who left Syria because of the systematic oppression they faced by their own home government be more loyal to that government? That simply does not make any sense at all. We have to remember, these aren't refugees just coming in because they want to mess with the government. They're coming because they are facing oppression from their home country and they want a better life. That is what we are proposing. Fourth response. We see here that actually refugees are actually build our economy in the home country they go to. We see, for example, that Syrian refugees are very incredibly so educated, as Liz pointed out, that they are doctors, they're lawyers, they're engineers who can come. Additionally, we see that refugees are actually 3 times more likely to start their own businesses. So if we want to talk about contribution to the government, that is exactly what we should be looking at. Next, their second argument is that there will be backlash. Essentially, what I'm hearing from Team Opposition is we are going to make white people angry. Okay, if it means that we are going to make the dominant group angry because now they have to deal with dissenting voices, then sure, I'm all for that. I'm all for dissenting voices. I'm all for pluralism, even if it makes the people there angry. Additionally here, his link chain was essentially the most tangential thing I've ever heard. He just talks about an increase in crime rates. Again, that's offensive. That's the stereotype exactly that we're trying to combat. But before I move on, yes?
Are you saying that all of these cases are refugees? Or are you realizing that this scope is very limited?
Okay, I'm saying refugees make up a lot of them, but even if we're saying we're looking at migrants traveling from Mexico to the United States, they also are still escaping a government that will still systematically oppress them, and they want better working conditions. But let's rebuild the proposition's case now. Essentially, we hear no engagement coming from the opposition side of the House on the proposition's case. We are the only one to provide you with what the principles in today's round are, what the model should be. Remember, our principle was that we should be increasing pluralism because in this round we are talking about these democracies. Liz so eloquently put it in our first substantive argument, we talk about why democracies strive to encompass the biggest breadth of the population, not just the most whitest, not just the most richest people in these countries, but everyone here. Additionally, we hear no responses on the second argument about the practical benefits of allowing foreigners to run for office. And Liz puts this in 2 ways, domestically and internationally. Domestically, she talks about how we have to change the material conditions. And the only way we can change material conditions is if we have someone speaking out, someone who's undergone the struggles themselves, or at least knows and can empathize with the struggle and the material inequality that these people face. Remember, we want these undocumented women, the ones who are questioning politicians during democratic conventions, to be the changing force in that they want to see in politics. Additionally, no engagement on international diplomacy about how we would be better able to engage with other countries because now we have politicians that actually understand the plight of their people. But now let's move on to the third substantive argument of the proposition, which is that proposing will allow for a check on hegemonic identity. And there are 2 layers of analysis here. First is we allow for the democratic principle of increasing true representation, and second, we allow for the democratic principle of increasing civic engagement. But first, on equal true representation. One of the most basic principles of democracy is that Liz lays out is the representation of the people's voice. Prohibiting foreigners from running for public office and speaking for them is principally harmful to increasing pluralism of voices. Right now, we see that in the United States, a presidential frontrunner, Mr. Donald Trump, does not represent the diversity of America. It does not represent anything that the United States strives to be. In fact, he represents the most bigoted, racist, and sexist parts of the United States. And yet he is allowed to run for office, but we're not allowing real immigrants who actually understand the plight of these people to run for office. Maybe if we had some politicians from Mexico, then they'd be able to stop Mr. Trump from trying to build this ridiculous wall. It's ironic that we use undocumented immigrants for exploited labor when we find it convenient, but we don't allow them to express their voice in politics. Right now, a white male politician will never empathize with a woman who wants to get an abortion, and a white male politician will never understand the plight of a Syrian refugee or a migrant farm working. Allowing foreigners to run for office would benefit the true democratic principle because it would actually allow for representation about people who actually understand these issues that white politicians are always bickering about on television. Today, our world is getting even more and more diverse. White people no longer represent the majority in many countries, so if we're talking about true representation, we have to include marginalized groups in that process. Next, second layer of analysis is that we allow for the democratic principle of increasing civic engagement. As a Chinese American woman, I don't see any other Chinese American women in government. I don't see a role model, someone I can aspire to be like. This discourages me from running for public office or pursuing a life in politics because I see that there's no one ahead of me who has also been able to do that. On a larger scale, we see that we would actually increase civic engagement by providing role models, people who someone can look up to. Having a foreigner would inspire people of similar either ethnic backgrounds or, for example, refugee statuses. Right now, we need role models for young individuals who, like me, want to participate in our community. Additionally, we saw that in 27 industrialized democracies, when we increased the voter turnout of marginalized populations, elections would shift 1/3 of a percentage point. So what we see here is when we actually empower the people to voice their opinion because they see a role model, someone who wants to fight for them, we see greater representation as well as greater civic engagement as a whole. So remember, there's essentially no engagement at all coming from the opposition. We are the only ones defending the true principles of democracy that aren't just limited to citizens, but everyone living within those borders. Because we on Team Proposition want democratic principles of equal representation and increasing civic engagement, we are proud to propose today's motion.
For your speech, I now invite the second opposition speaker to go.
I'm going to have it written down after the Chinese for the other speech. We can't.
Yeah, but I don't know. They were all around 8 minutes. I'll tell you. So I invite the opposition speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us take a walk through the side propositions model. According to their side, a person, any person, can simply walk and cross the border into the United States, vote, and actually change the country's policies. Now, let's change that to a bigger spectrum. A huge influx of Mexicans suddenly go to the United States, are undocumented, and basically have no right to stay there, and are just simply there at that moment, can basically vote and change the country's situation. Basically, change the whole country's democratic system. How is that possible? Because according to their side of the house, foreigners can vote. According to their side of the house, undocumented citizens, like illegal immigrants, can actually vote as well and change the country. According to their side of the house, it doesn't matter if it's an illegal immigrant, they can basically change the policy of the whole country. It doesn't matter if that illegal immigrant doesn't necessarily care about the country, they can simply have the right to vote and change that country's policies because they're simply present in that moment at that time. Now, tell us, ladies and gentlemen, tell us, side proposition, how exactly are you benefiting the country's national interest? How exactly are you trying to develop the country by having this side? But you disagree, yes?
Yes, here's how we help the country's national interest. When you have over 11 million individuals in the United States who do not get their rights represented in the government, that is oppressive and that is perpetuating hegemonic identities.
Now, they're only focusing on illegal immigrants who are in the United States, but they completely fail to understand, and according to their model, people can actually come to the United States and can actually have the right to change the country's legislative policies. How is that? Because you're allowing illegal immigrants to change the policies. You're allowing foreigners to come into the country and change the voting processes. You're allowing these foreigners from China, North Korea, South Korea to actually have a voice in the United States government matters. Why? Because they're foreigners. Why? Because they're illegal. Because they're illegal document. They're not a citizen of the United States, and it doesn't matter if they're illegally documented. They can still have a voice. No, thank you. Furthermore, moving on. We believe that the government has an obligation to the people. Why is that? Because these citizens pay taxes. These citizens have actually worked towards the government. According to their side of the house, the citizens in that country do not necessarily have to do anything regarding the government. They just have to be someone from another country, be present in the electoral process, and suddenly have a voice in the changing the country's legislative processes. In other words, anyone from anywhere from the world can come into the United States right now and change the country's benefits, change how the country views upon things that the country knows best. No, thank you. Furthermore, they never really explained to us how these undocumented illegal immigrants will be able to vote and how their votes will actually count according to their model. No, thank you. Furthermore, they don't have any engagement with the backlash against minorities. They have no attacks against the lack of legitimacy of the government, and they have no explanations on the burden of the international community when suddenly anyone can go anywhere and vote and change any country anyhow they want to. Moving on. In case of refugees, the interests of refugees do not necessarily have to be towards that country they're present in. Their interests can lie into other things. For example, suddenly 11 million immigrants of the Syrian refugee want to change the state of Utah into a Muslim country, into a Muslim state. They can do so. How? Because they can send a majority of Syrian refugees into that state and suddenly vote, and the majority will be like, and the majority votes will present that yes, the state can have a national religion of Islam. In other words, they can change a whole state just by having more people in the electoral process. No, thank you. Moving on. Now moving on to the other side of the spectrum. Now their side of the model only focuses on the United States, developed countries where they will really clearly care about the immigrants. Now moving on. No, thank you. Moving on to the other side of the spectrum, corrupt governments. Governments that are developing. Governments that are vulnerable to foreign exploits. Governments that do not necessarily care about their people, nor do they care about the other people. They only care about their self-interest. Political leaders that only care about economical benefits and their personal growth. In this side of the house, we will be moving on to the third argument now, corruption. Our premise is to prove to you why their policy will cause further damage to the more unstable countries in the world. How is that? Many developing countries in the world have corrupt electoral processes. This is already bad in the status quo. However, according to their ideological model about empowering illegal immigrants, this will actually get worse. How is that? No, thank you. Developing countries like Somalia or Uganda with extremely corrupt governments are vulnerable to foreign people. Why is that? Because these people will have money and connections, in contrast to the government of these countries. These people are representing huge, powerful enterprises who can basically come into these countries and overpower them through economical resources. However, according to their side of the house, according to their model, when these companies will have an open door to exploit these countries through a political level, this will mean chaos. Why is that? Basically, these companies can have huge influx of people, a huge influx of their employees move into these developing countries, huge influx of French people suddenly coming into Somalia and then voting for electoral processes in Somalia. In other words, developed countries will have a huge advantage over developing countries. Why is that? Because these developing countries will now have been vulnerable to foreign exploits. How is that possible? Because these developing countries are going through deplorable conditions like extreme hunger, poverty, illiteracy, and health problems. On top of that, these countries have corrupt governments causing unrest amongst people. So this makes countries vulnerable to foreign interests, and foreigners with personal interest can easily gain advantage in these situations. Basically, what will happen in this scenario? Let's examine this. No, thank you. Somalia, a country in Africa struggling to develop. In other words, China can suddenly decide in their government policy that they want to send 9 million people to Somalia. No, thank you. These 9 million people in Somalia can suddenly have an active role in the government, can suddenly take part in elections. And even if the Somalian government and the Somalian people do not vote for these Chinese people can get votes from these Chinese political leaders can get votes from the Chinese population. In other words, Somalia can be a second China in Africa. In other words, China can have a second country in Africa and exploit their resources and completely take control of other countries that are completely vulnerable and can be easily manipulated. So in other words, what are we doing here? We are